Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. For decades, the fight against smoking has been waged on two fronts: helping smokers quit and limiting the tobacco industry's influence. But as safer alternatives like nicotine vapes and pouches continue to grow in popularity, public health is shifting its focus, not just on eliminating smoking, but eliminating nicotine itself. Has tobacco control morphed into nicotine control? Joining us today to tackle that question is Dr. Jonathan Foulds, Professor of Public Health Sciences and Psychiatry at Penn State University College of Medicine. A trained clinical psychologist, Dr. Foulds has dedicated his career to developing and evaluating effective methods to help smokers overcome tobacco addiction. He was a founding member and vice president of the Association for the Treatment of Tobacco Use and Dependence, and has testified before the FDA on behalf of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, particularly on the regulation of nicotine replacement therapies. Dr. Foulds, welcome back to RegWatch.
Good to be back.
So let's start with the big question. Has tobacco control morphed into nicotine control?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's always had a problem with young people using nicotine, and I think that's become a bit of a focus, maybe an overriding focus. We've had some recent pushback. There have been some recent publications pointing out that people over the age of 55 or 60, smoking rates and nicotine use are almost the same level as they were 10, 15 years ago. And that these are the people that are dying because of tobacco use, and they deserve a bit more attention and focus. But I think the what you're pitching as the battle against nicotine is really focusing on young people. It's understandable. We don't want, 12-year-olds becoming addicted to a substance and spending their pocket money on it and their earnings for the rest of their life. And some of us think that some of the reasons for that have been a bit exaggerated, the evidence. And I think we're seeing some pushback against that. You're pointing out that the focus is zeroed in more on just nicotine rather than, say, cigarettes as it was, 25 years ago. That's partly because so few young people are smoking cigarettes nowadays. Less than 2% smoking daily, a lot less than 2%. And, that's a great success. That's a big success for public health. There are many reasons for it. It's not like one thing is the cause of it. But I think that's part of the explanation why the focus on nicotine.
So before we dive any deeper, which I'm sure we will, could you share a bit about your background for our viewers?
Sure. I as you can probably tell, I'm not from the United States. I'm from the UK. I trained as a clinical psychologist, and then I chose to do my PhD at the Institute of Psychiatry, and it happened to be on the role of nicotine in cigarette smoking. I was fortunate to have mentors and supervisors like Mike Russell and Martin Jarvis, Robert West, and to work with a very talented research group. And so I decided I was going to stay in that field. I liked the idea that by helping people to just change their one particular aspect of their behavior, the lighting of a cigarette and putting it in your mouth and puffing on it, if you can help people to stop doing that, you can probably add 5, 10 healthy years to their life. So, I just thought I'm a clinical psychologist, and clinical psychologists tend to focus on, depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and mental disorders, which are very important. But lots of people were working on that, and I thought, hey, not many things a clinical psychologist can do to save a life, and this is one that I felt at that time needed more attention.
And you also spent some time working or presented with the World Health Organization with regard to smokeless tobacco. Tell us about that.
Well, I was invited to speak at a WHO meeting in think it was Helsinki, and I was asked to do a talk on smokeless tobacco. And I wouldn't call myself at the time, I was young and I wasn't an expert on that topic, but I prepared the presentation based on the evidence that there was, largely focusing on snus because the meeting was in Scandinavia. And the thing that really got me more involved in that area was the fact that I did the talk and I was pretty confident. The evidence was very clear that snus in Sweden is much less harmful than smoking, and that's why many Swedes had switched to it. And I didn't think I was saying anything controversial. And but the Swedish public health folks at the meeting were very upset. Let's put it that way. And I thought, wow, I didn't expect the blowback. I didn't think it was controversial. And I realized that I'd stepped into a little bit of a hornet's nest, and I thought I better make sure I've got my facts right. And when I, checked all the evidence that there was at that time, it was still clear. And so I ended up writing a paper for tobacco control that reviewed all the evidence, and basically made the case that in Sweden, the popularity of snus in that country had a net positive effect on public health because it had replaced smoking in men, and the fact that it was, particularly men at that time that used the product, clarified the fact that it wasn't exclusively the public health campaigns in Sweden that had reduced smoking, because those public health campaigns didn't just focus on men. But smoking had come down significantly faster in men than women, and that clarified, and only men were using snus. That clarified, what was the cause of the reduction in smoking, and it was clearly the switch to a less harmful form of nicotine use. And that was that at the time. I came to the United States, and I didn't really focus so much on smokeless tobacco. But then e-cigs came along, and many of the same principles could potentially apply.
So let me ask you then, with regard to e-cigarettes, nicotine vaping, is it an effective tool for quitting smoking?
I'm going to stick with the evidence, and we have one of the most highly respected review groups, the Cochrane Reviews, who do systematic analyses of all the evidence, using a widely accepted format. And they have now concluded for a few years that e-cigarettes clearly help smokers to quit smoking. Nicotine e-cigs do it significantly better than non-nicotine e-cigarettes. And in fact, e-cigarettes do it significantly better than nicotine replacement therapy, an approved medication. So that's what the evidence suggests. And really, we shouldn't really be surprised. It's almost obvious and commonsensical. Nicotine replacement therapy works. The patch and the gum and the lozenges, they replace the drug that our people addicted to and allow them to transfer their dependence onto another product without the 7,000 harmful chemicals. And why would an e-cig that delivers nicotine be any different? And the reason it's probably slightly better, or maybe quite a bit better, is that it replaces the behavioral aspects. It's closer in the behaviors to smoking, but also, as we now know, some of the newer forms of e-cig can deliver nicotine pretty much as efficiently as a cigarette, whereas the NRTs were much slower and less efficient in delivering nicotine. So it just follows kind of pharmacological principles that you would expect. It works.
Some of the research that you've done over the last couple of years actually showed that advanced devices, not only do they deliver nicotine more efficiently, but they may actually encourage dependence more than, say, first generation devices.
Yes, well, simply because they're more efficient in delivering nicotine. And if we're talking about smokers, and all the studies that I do on e-cigarettes, we're recruiting cigarette smokers and encouraging them to try the e-cigs in our studies and all our nicotine product studies. So these people are already dependent on nicotine. So I wouldn't say that the e-cigarette is causing dependence. It's just replacing where the person gets the drug from. But you're right. You know, Cigalikes way back in 2010 to 13 uh, did not deliver much nicotine. They were slightly more nicotine than a placebo, basically. But then when more high-powered mod devices and then dual and salt nicotine devices came along, they were more efficient in delivering nicotine almost as efficiently as a cigarette. I just found on the Altria website a PK study that they've not published, but they've presented it at a conference, so it's on their website showing the PK, the nicotine delivery from the Enjoy Ace device, which is one of those that's been authorized by FDA in the United States, and it gets a nicotine boost within about 5 minutes of around 13, 14 nanograms per mil. Whereas in that study, a cigarette was getting about 17 to 19 nanograms per mil. So it's almost the same. And there's also evidence from other studies that, if you take a smoker and you get them in the lab and you give them an e-cig that they've never tried before, then they get they get a decent amount of nicotine. But if you let them have it for a month and you ask them to come into the lab again and you measure it again, they've learned how to use it. And I've been like a guinea pig from some of our studies and tried some products really just to practice the procedures. And I know that as a non-smoker, and also as somebody who's trying a product that's new, I'm a little wary. I don't want to make myself feel ill because I'm not used to nicotine by puffing away really hard. So, and I think the people who are in some of these studies who are trying a product for the first time, they're the same. It's unfamiliar to them, so they don't want to go puffing really hard and getting a big nicotine boost and maybe making themselves sick. So it's not surprising. And so some of these things on the market now can deliver nicotine pretty much like a cigarette.
Now, I mean, to a lot of people, that's a good thing. I think back to an interview we did in 2016 with Dr. John Britton, at the time the head of Royal College of Physicians in the UK, handling the issues on tobacco. And he was adamant that there needs to be more advancement in the products in order to get more nicotine to the brain to break down that blood-brain barrier. Because if you're not, then a heavy smoker is not going to ever have a chance of quitting if the devices are not delivering the nicotine. Yet now, though, because there's this shift that's gone on, I hear a lot that is a bad thing. Like that particular feature, it's being framed as engineered by big tobacco to get kids more addicted because it's delivering, more efficient nicotine. But yet that's what is demanded, to be successful to get smokers to quit.
And you raise a very important point. And I'm saying the modern devices are more efficient. And I am saying as a good thing for smokers to be able to switch. These products are helping smokers to quit, to switch off of cigarettes and onto e-cigs. I do think of it as a good thing. Whereas I think the general public and many doctors wouldn't necessarily interpret it that way because there are studies out not that long ago, which ask surveys of physicians in the United States and find that more than 80% of the United States doctors believe mistakenly that nicotine is the substance in cigarettes and tobacco that causes cancer and COPD and cardiovascular disease, when that's entirely not true. So it's not surprising that when somebody says, "Oh, these new e-cigarettes are more efficient in delivering nicotine," that some people who've got the same message that the doctors have, that nicotine's the bad thing, are thinking, "Oh, that's not a good thing. Maybe we should cap that like they've done in Europe." And I don't agree. I mean, two separate issues. One is helping existing smokers to get off of cigarettes, which is, in my mind, the single most important thing to save their life and make them healthier. Um, the other thing is not wanting young people or non-smokers to become addicted to nicotine. So, you know, I completely agree with the latter thing as being important. Um, but you know, in the United States, it's illegal to sell these products to people under the age of 21. And we actually have seen the use of nicotine products significantly come down in the last few years in for all products, pretty much. The only one that's risen in school kids at all in the last couple of years is nicotine pouches. And that's because it's risen from almost zero to a couple of percent. But in the whole scheme of things, you know, thinking back, you know, when I came to the United States around 2000, you know, the recent data at that time from 97, 98 was that 25% of high school kids smoked cigarettes daily. They were, you know, a quarter of high school students were addicted to cigarettes. Now I think that exact same, for that same behavior, it's less than 1%. So we've made great strides in the right direction.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty much collapsed to a great extent. And we've been covering this. We just had Dr. Ken Warner on the show to talk about it in depth. Why is it? And this is his point, and I think many people's points is how come public health and tobacco control are not celebrating the collapse in teen smoking?
Well, he's made that point repeatedly, and I think he's exactly right. It is something we should be celebrating, um, and I don't know the answer is the truth. I don't know why. I think you know some of the organizations um, have a focus on young people. You know, the campaign for tobacco-free kids. That's in the title of the organization, so that's their focus, and so. Uh, they've switched their concern to things like e-cigarettes. And there was a time there, you know, about 2018, 19, when e-cig use in school kids had increased dramatically. And that was a concern. But it's now come back down again. It did seem to be something of a fad. And then, you know, various things happened, including changes in the law and so forth, that has got that pretty much under control. I'm one of the folks that agree with Ken Warner that we need to have more attention to helping existing smokers to quit because these are the ones that are going to die.
And I don't think it maybe is a political issue on either side. It just might be that activists have a hard time patting themselves on the back and saying, job well done.
Maybe, and maybe for some, there may be a concern that they might put themselves out of a job if, you know, mission accomplished. But I think, you know, we were talking about tobacco control as a whole, and tobacco control, in my mind, the aim of the game is to improve health by helping people to not be addicted to the most harmful products to health. And those are the smoked products. I think there is consensus about that in people who study it and people who are experts. Um, not as much of a strong consensus as I think there should be based on the evidence. And you can see when you have discussions on this topic, and particularly if you switch the topic to nicotine pouches, you can see that people have a problem in admitting that some of these products are really, really much, much, much less harmful than cigarettes. You know, with e-cigs, there are chemicals in the heated liquid that go into the aerosol and they go into your lungs, and that's a very critical and sensitive part of the body. And so the argument, well, how do we know? We haven't had long-term study yet. That studies yet. That's a valid point. And you say, okay, you're right, but the best estimate of the harms we can get now from many, many studies that have looked at the toxicants that you absorb into your body from e-cigs versus cigarettes. And it's much, much lower number of toxicants and much lower concentrations of the most harmful ones. So that's the basis for saying that switching to e-cigarettes is definitely harm reduction, because you're just getting a much lower load of harmful chemicals into your body. But then when you come, if the person has issues with that, they say, well, how do we know, propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, we haven't studied that for 40 years yet. Then you switch the conversation to nicotine pouches, where the person is really just absorbing nicotine into their mouth, just like nicotine gum, really. Sure, you can be concerned about kids becoming addicted to it. That's fine. But the health effects from that really have to be orders of magnitude. And there's no way that in 20 years we're going to find out that it's much more harmful than we thought. We know the harms of nicotine, and they're just much less than the harms from the 7,000 other chemicals in cigarettes.
So keeping all of this in mind then, Dr. Foulds, where are we right now with FDA regulation? Because these products, whether nicotine vapes or the Zyn, the FDA just did approve, granted marketing authorization for 20 Zyn nicotine pouch products. And this was just in January, and there were flavors involved. But there's been very little movement on vaping products.
Yes. So there is a problem there, because we have a couple of thousand brands of cigarettes on the market, grandfathered in. They're all lethal when used as intended. Every brand, every one of those 2,000 will take, if you keep smoking, about 10 years off your life. And the shorter life that you live will have longer periods of illness than if you weren't a smoker. And compared to that, there have been thousands of applications, millions of applications for e-cigs, and we've got 43 authorizations, but they really come down to 4 or 5 devices, with different liquids attached to that. So it's not giving consumers the choice that they need. And it's very hard for me to believe that there are not more product applications that could be allowed on the market, and would be benefit. The standard is appropriate for the protection of public health. And it's hard for me to believe that there are not many more e-cigarettes that would be appropriate for the protection of public health. And we know that other countries like the UK or New Zealand or almost any country you care to study have, a lighter touch regulation, and are not having terrible problems. It's helping them to reduce their smoking. Smoking prevalence is lower in New Zealand than as the United States. And they're having other challenges. They're having challenges with young people getting access. They're having challenges with products being illegally imported into the country, like we have in this country. But at least there is more consumer choice. So if you're going to ask me what's the new administration, the new government going to do, I don't have a crystal ball, and I think we could all agree that it's very hard to predict what they're going to do. Other than that, they like to cut government employees. That's about the only thing one can say right now.
Yeah. Well, let's just touch on that for a second, because there, are some changes at the executive branch level that's affecting FDA, NIH, CDC, definitely its employees. I think those of us in the industry, are hoping that there are actually going to be some changes to policy, some directional changes, but it's hard to see how those might happen if, these agencies are kind of just worrying about survival?
It's almost impossible to guess right now. And obviously, I get funding from NIH to do my research, and so it goes without saying almost that I don't agree with the way the current government is going about this. I think it's going to be harmful to the country as well as to public health. And I think it's being done recklessly without any thought. So, for example, the people at FDA, that's not taxpayer dollars even. The FDA Center for Tobacco Products, take one example, that's funded by monies that are required to be given from the cigarette manufacturers to FDA to regulate them, just as the medicines part of FDA is funded by pharma companies. You have to pay a levy to pay for FDA to regulate them. So these cuts actually slow up the process of and the efficiency of regulation. So probably best not to get me started on why this is not the way to do it.
The one thing about the NIH I wanted to ask you about, because I think it's important for our viewers to know, one of the things that RegWatch has covered quite a bit is the fact that the NIH seems to, and researchers like yourself, not you particularly, but researchers like yourself on this show, have said that the NIH pretty much does not fund research if it's going to look at the efficacy directly of e-cigarettes. Like, it seems that only bad research when it comes to e-cigarettes is funded to come out of NIH. Is that correct? And if so, could some changes at least happen in that direction once this mess is sorted out?
Well, you said, I don't know what your exact wording was, but I just want to be clear. I think what you meant was that it seems that there's more funding for research that's trying to find harms from e-cigarettes and these products. And I think there is some truth to that. It's certainly not only. There are ways that researchers can get funded studies and do studies that have equal ability to detect potential harms and potential benefits. So this might be getting into the inside baseball and the weeds, but let me explain why this is. So some of the funds that we apply for are from the FDA Center for Tobacco Products, and they ask NIH to administer the process because they're experienced in reviewing and administering grants. So the money goes via NIH, but it comes from FDA Center for Tobacco Products. So they're allowed by the legislation, by the law, to fund research that will help them regulate tobacco products. There's another part of FDA, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, that evaluates therapeutic products. Okay, so if you get a grant, if you apply for a grant and you say you want to study smoking cessation, you want to find if a product helps people to quit smoking, it treats tobacco addiction, then FDA Center for Tobacco Products can't fund that, right? Because that's another part of FDA's job. That's the way the law is. And so if they are concerned that if they funded that, the tobacco industry would say, all this money that you charge us for your regulation is being misused in a way not consistent with the law. So here's what researchers can do, however, and we've done this. We've done some studies, and we're currently doing another one, which we think provide a model for how FDA could recommend the kind of studies that companies can do, how they design their studies to try and seek authorization. And so what we do is we do randomized clinical trials in smokers who don't have a plan to quit smoking, okay? But they're willing to reduce their smoking, and we randomized them. Previously we did one where we randomized them to placebo or low or medium nicotine e-cigarettes. And we also did another arm that got randomized to a cigarette substitute. It was really a fake cigarette, and you got the behavioral part without the e-cig part, and without the vapor. And it wasn't a smoking cessation trial. We encouraged people to reduce their smoking and to see if the products facilitated that. We asked them all four groups to use these products to replace your smoking. And the primary outcome wasn't smoking cessation. It was actually a measure of carcinogen exposure, NNL in urine. And we found that people who were randomized to the high nicotine e-cigarette had significantly lower carcinogen exposure by the end of the trial than people who tried to reduce their smoking, because all the groups reduced their smoking, but the ones with the high nicotine e-cigarette had a lower carcinogen exposure than the people with the cigarette substitute, for example, who are analogous to people who just tried to do it on their own without an e-cig. But we did also ask the people, we quantified their smoking, we measured their CO as another outcome. And so we could identify the people who had actually completely quit smoking, even though they never planned to. And in that trial, we did publish those results, which was that of the people in the high nicotine e-cigarette, about just over 11% of them completely quit, even though they didn't plan to. Whereas only 1 to 3% of the other groups, like the placebo e-cig or the cigarette substitute, quit completely. So we were able to do a study that was not designed primarily as a quit smoking study, but just still report on that. And we're doing a study just like that one with nicotine pouches. Placebo versus medium versus high nicotine pouches, double blind. And these are people we're recruiting to the trial, people who are interested in reducing their smoking and using pouches to replace them. So we'll see what happens. But the primary outcome again is not quitting smoking. The primary outcome is reducing smoking and biomarkers like NNL and carbon monoxide exposure. And I think I hope that we can persuade FDA, because they're funding these studies via NIH, that this is a clinical trial design that they could recommend to manufacturers of products who want to apply for PMTAs, for example, permission to be on the market. Now, these studies are not cheap. Clinical trials with long-term follow-ups are not a cheap thing to do. You need to be a pretty big company and to know how to do those trials to do them. But I do think there is a need for clear guidance. As you know, there have been some lawsuits from companies that were denied the ability to continue to market their products when they applied to FDA, and they sued FDA because they felt there wasn't clear enough guidance in what was required. And so we're doing these studies funded by FDA and NIH to try and show that these trials they're feasible. You can recruit smokers who don't want to quit, but they're willing to use products, and both with e-cigarettes or nicotine pouches and other products, and they'll continue to take them even in a placebo-controlled study, and you can measure meaningful effects. So I think the e-cig trial went well, and it's been published, and we've published a lot of papers from it. It's included in the Cochrane Review, and I hope the same happens with our nicotine pouch trial.
It seems that the whole issue with FDA comes down to flavors, that flavors in e-cigarettes are not appropriate for the protection of public health in its narrow view in terms of, youth like flavors, but so do adults. So where are we at? Like, do you have any concerns about this approach that the FDA has?
Well, the FDA has lots of data showing that young people underage prefer products with good flavors. Now, I don't think they deny that adult smokers prefer products with good flavors as well. But because they are very concerned about youth uptake of these novel products, their regulation is partly focused on preventing the attractiveness or reducing the attractiveness of the products to underage users. But I do believe, I may be wrong, but I think it's the case that if a company conducted a trial in which basically proved that adult smokers find it easier to completely switch or to reduce significantly their smoking with flavors other than tobacco flavor or menthol flavor, or even just menthol flavor, if they could show that to a good degree in a well-designed study, I think FDA would be more open to that evidence. And of course, we don't see all the detail that's in all the applications from companies, and even the ones that we do see have some redaction as exactly what went on and what the studies showed, unless the companies choose to publish them. And I wish the companies would actually publish more of their data so that scientists can kind of like look at what they've done. And I look on the companies' websites because I like some of the companies have got loads of abstracts and detail. So I am interested in what they are doing, and I think some of the science is actually very, very solid and persuasive. And I include myself in this, sometimes complain about the over focus on youth prevention. The truth is that helps harm reduction as well, because if youth use increases, then regulators, the public, parents, politicians, they all become much more concerned and are less likely to allow potentially helpful products to be on the market. So I do think we have to kind of realize that all the work that's been done to reduce nicotine product use in kids is actually helpful to enable us to allow more products onto the market. And I think, I mean, I'm not inside FDA at all, but I think that evidence was probably part of the reason they authorized Zyn with the flavors included, because they had persuasive evidence that youth uptake was actually not so high. I think in the publicly available, data sets like Monitoring the Future and the National Youth Interview Survey, it was 2% around that mark of young people using nicotine pouches, not even that particular product. And that was reassuring because they've been on the market for almost 10 years.
Dr. Foulds, you have a new book out titled Treating Addiction to Tobacco and Nicotine Products. It provides a strong clinical perspective on tobacco dependence treatment while also addressing harm reduction and the continuum of risk for non-cigarette nicotine products. How does this book differ from previous works in the field?
Well, this book, I wrote it with Dr. Jill Williams, who's a psychiatrist at Rutgers University and a nicotine treatment expert. And she was the one that initially had the idea of writing the book, and she asked me, hey, can we write it together? And so she has been at the forefront, along with some other people, in addressing and focusing on nicotine addiction, but primarily smoking at the high rates in people with mental health problems. And so I think the book has a bit more of a focus on that population than some of the books that have been published before. But the book is designed to be balanced, ordinary smokers with mental health problems, and also it's designed to be balanced in that it recognizes the reality that the problem and the use of tobacco products is no longer primarily just cigarettes. And we're trying to be forward-looking. If less than 2% of high school seniors are smoking cigarettes daily, whereas more of them are using e-cigarettes or nicotine pouches and other products, then this is going to be the future. That there will be more people who are dual users using more than one nicotine product, and there will be less people in the population who are smoking cigarettes. So we try, and we've written the book with that in mind. This is the new reality, and we have. I'm not. I know that many of your viewers are pro harm reduction people, and so this book is not a harm reduction book. It's really a book to try and distill the latest evidence on what clinicians can do to more effectively help their patients to quit smoking. But it does point out that we're now living in a world where it's not just cigarettes. There are many products. So there are a couple of chapters about how we got there and what the other products are. And then towards the end of the book, there's a chapter that just does talk about, well, we focus on helping them to quit smoking because we think that's where it's still the most of the harm, and in adults, it's the most prevalent product. But toward the end, we also talk about, well, what if your patient is interested in using another product? What should your approach be? And we still take the view that for clinicians who are working in the current environment, then it's understandable that their first choice would be products that are authorized by the Food and Drug Administration for the treatment of tobacco dependence, for tobacco use disorder, the technical term, to help people quit smoking. But we point out that some people say, I've tried all of those. I don't want them. I've got a friend who uses an e-cigarette, a friend who uses another nicotine product. What do you think about that? So we talk about that. And we also talk about the reality, that many clinicians will have a patient who comes in, they have quit smoking. They're now using an e-cig. It's helped them to reduce or quit their smoking. Should we be rushing them off of the e-cig or the nicotine pouch, or what? And we say that this is probably a big step in the right direction. So there's no need to rush your patients off of these products. The single most important thing is to say to them that getting off cigarettes or any smoked product is the single most important thing you can do. And you should use whatever product helped you to get off of those for as long as it takes. But if you come to decide that you want to stop the e-cig or stop the nicotine pouch, and you're confident you won't go back to cigarettes, then I encourage you to do that as well. Because nicotine isn't good for you. It's not nearly as harmful as the other stuff. And if you find that you're addicted to it, then come and see me and we'll try and help you to get off those as well.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about misperceptions around vaping and nicotine with regard to the medical community. I wanted to share just a quick story. Yesterday, actually, I was visiting a dental specialist because I've got a crown that needs some work done on it. And
I've just had that done.
Oh, there you go. Right. And so expensive. And it's a specialist that I've seen for over 12 years, but I have not seen her for about 5. And when I walked in and we just got acquainted again a little bit, and she was asking me what I was working on, and I told her, the vaping stuff, and she immediately interrupted me and she goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but I have to tell you, there's new research that's out that shows that vaping is worse than smoking for your mouth health." And I'm just staring at her going, whoa. Is tobacco harm reduction a valid use of the principle of harm reduction? And what do you think about, here's a dentist who just has got vaping is worse than smoking?
Yeah. And we know from these surveys that I mentioned before that this is not uncommon. This is prevalent. And health professionals are just like the rest of us. They get a lot of their information from the news stories, from the media. And some of the training they get also may be inaccurate, because it does tend to focus on the harms from things. So clearly, I have to keep an open mind. There could be new studies that find something different from what we've understood to date. So I don't know what where the information that the dentist got was. But from what I know about the studies I've read, and I try and keep up every single day to what the science is showing us, I go on PubMed, I type in nicotine, what's new today, every day. Um, and I will be stunned if there's any evidence that I haven't seen that suggests that e-cigs are more harmful to your mouth than cigarettes. And people are surprised when I tell them, which is more likely to cause oral cancer, smokeless tobacco or cigarettes? Most people say smokeless tobacco. No, by far cigarettes. Not only is it more likely to cause lung cancer, it's more likely to cause oral cancer. And in fact, snus evidence from Sweden suggests it doesn't actually cause oral cancer. Very unlikely that nicotine pouches could cause oral cancer because they have none of there's no tobacco in there at all. Now, your dentist was talking about e-cigarettes, so it would be very hard to imagine what the mechanism might be for that to be worse for your mouth than cigarettes. And we do know that this information has gotten across the general public as well. And we do know that there are some, I guess, what I would call bad actors within the scientific community who, for reasons that I don't really imagine, like to repeatedly publish poorly done studies that don't properly take account of the people in the studies and look at the health effects. So it's not uncommon. I was going to say every week, but at least every month, there's a study done where they compare in the population the chances of dying of cancer or heart disease in people who've tried e-cigarettes to quit smoking and people who quit without anything. And a very common mistake they make is they just ask people, have you tried e-cigarettes? E-cigarettes, yes or no? Have you quit smoking, yes or no? And they don't take account of the fact that most of the people in the population who successfully quit smoking are elderly people who quit smoking in 1963, didn't use, I don't mean that year, but before we had e-cigarettes, right? And so whereas the e-cigarette users, by definition, they must have been smoking until about 2013. They had to be smoking then because e-cigarettes weren't available until that time in this country, not en masse. And so they're comparing groups that are already biased. A proportion of the population quit smoking without e-cigarettes. Yes, that group, a lot of them quit smoking decades ago. And so you get the wrong answer. Another common mistake is you take groups of people who've tried e-cigarettes versus those who didn't, and you look at their smokers who didn't, and you look at their illnesses. And again, they don't take into account or properly control for, is the words we use in the research, the amount of smoking that the groups did. And sometimes they'll say they've controlled for smoking by, controlling for whether they were a current smoker, an ex-smoker, or a never smoker. But that's a very poor way to control for smoking in the stats. A much better way is to calculate their lifetime pack years. So your cigarettes per day times the number of years to get a measure of total exposure. But what you tend to find is that the people who've tried e-cigarettes have smoked for many more years than the comparison group. And so you get, these papers saying, hey, e-cigs are almost as harmful as cigarettes. Well, it's not the case. The people in your comparison group have smoked for much, much longer. And you can read the paper and it should be obvious to reviewers. Say, no, that's not an adequate study. And so some people write letters to the journals to say, no, this paper that you've published doesn't adequately show the findings, the conclusions. But these kind of papers get a lot of play in the media because it's like an unexpected finding, and it's like a whoa, guess what? When in actual fact they're not valid scientific studies. So I think, we can't trust the companies to be clarifying this issue, the industry, for many reasons. Number one, people wouldn't really trust them anyway, for reasons. And also they're not allowed to make claims like that. Um, so I think people who study these things, scientists who are familiar with the data, we have to actually speak out more clearly, try and correct it. God forbid we have to go on Twitter and social media and try and get the truth out there. And I avoided social media for many, many years. I just thought it was a waste of time. And then I got so frustrated, I thought, all right, I'm gonna have to go on there just to kind of do a little bit to redress the balance for what the public are getting. I don't think I make a ton of difference, but I think it's worth the shot anyway.
Well, I'd say you do actually, because I mean, if anybody who's watched your Twitter feed, your X feed for any period of time will just be educated upside down and backwards because you always are posting great research, insightful comments. Your Twitter handle has been at the bottom of your name key that we've used throughout this episode, and I highly encourage people to go and take a look. They can also find pinned at the top of your X account right now is a post on your book, and some may want to check that out. It's actually not too expensive for being something that's clinical, and people should check that out. Let me ask you this last question, Dr. Foulds. It's regarding the 18 million current vapors. I think that's the number in the United States. Now, they've already quit, but they, have every, intention, it appears, to continue to be nicotine consumers. They seem to never be referenced. It's always like, the smokers trying to quit and what do we do about them and what's going on with the youth. But you have 18 million people that are currently using nicotine vaping products. Shouldn't we be considering, making sure that they have robust variety and so forth that's available to them?
I think you're correct that there are a large number of e-cigarette users in the world and the United States. And I think you're also correct to characterize the majority of them as not planning to quit vaping, in the next year. They're not in a rush. I think many of them are ex-smokers and they believe that vaping probably saved their life. And why would they rush to get off of that and maybe at greater risk of relapse? So I think that's part of the reason that many of them are fine for now to continue vaping. And I think most of those people have found a product, or I think typically they have like 2 or 3 products that they're quite happy with. I think the stats tell us that the majority of them are using products in this country not currently authorized by FDA. The latest data I've seen suggests that at least in 2023, 93% or more of the e-cigs sold in the United States were not authorized by FDA. So that's a problem. But I would say, with my public health hat on, that it probably is a bit better for your health to come off them at some point. Not if you think you're at risk of going back to cigarettes, obviously, but you're inhaling nicotine and some chemicals into your lungs. The nicotine is probably raising your risk of cardiovascular disease slightly. Nothing like a cigarette, but a little bit. But everybody has to make their own choices based on their circumstances. I mean, I myself, I had an illness. I had to go to hospital, and I wasn't allowed to drink caffeine while I was in hospital. So I got a caffeine withdrawal headache. And this particular illness was one where it could have come back, and one of the signs might be a really bad headache. And so I made the choice for myself that I would try and stay off caffeine. Not because I believe that caffeine is bad for me, but because I don't want to have caffeine withdrawal headaches causing me to be concerned that this illness was coming back. So everybody's got their own reasons. I mean, the truth is, I now drink coffee 3 or 4 times a day. I've decided the benefits outweigh that little issue that I was concerned about. So that's an example how we all have to, make our own decisions, and hopefully get the best, access the best information as to guide us as to the health risks. I personally would encourage people, once they've got off of cigarettes, to not stay on e-cigs for their whole life, because we all get to a point in our life where we're closer to, we've got other risk factors. We've put on weight, we've got higher cholesterol, we've got diabetes, and nicotine can it's not benign. It's just not nearly as harmful as cigarette smoking. And so it's more in the ballpark of risks that we kind of accept in our lives. We do lots of things that are not risk-free. Some of us drive our car more than the speed limit, occasionally. But we think that's in the ballpark of things that are okay. I'll take the consequences. I won't do it in built-up areas and so forth. But I do think that we should be investigating ways to help people quit when they want to, because some people do. I'm slightly infamous for saying that e-cigarettes are less addictive than cigarettes. We haven't talked about that, but I think some of the new products may end up being as closer to cigarettes in addiction, and so some people may decide they want to quit them and find it not easy. They may find it very like cigarettes, and I think we should have studies now, and I think I saw today that a new one had been funded by NIH, help design a trial to help people to come off e-cigarettes, and I think that's all well and good. And also, us having effective ways to help people come off e-cigarettes, some people who are listening may say, "Oh, we don't need that. They don't cause as much harm." But the fact that such treatments exist actually help us feel more relaxed about having these products on the market. Because if somebody gets addicted and then they want to quit, there is a way to do it. They don't have to be forced to pay their money and take any risks there are for decades. So I think it is an important step. And we've seen some progress recently. There's a paper by Nancy Rigotti and colleagues on cytisinicline that was an excellent study and showed that medicine, which is kind of very like varenicline, was effective in helping people to quit e-cigs. There's also other behavioral methods. The Truth Campaign, I've done a big trial published in JAMA that was effective in helping young people to quit e-cigarettes. Interestingly, they got quite high quit rates, and the control group who did not get intervention also had quite high quit rates, which I interpret as consistent with the idea that e-cigarettes are not quite as addictive as cigarettes are. But so there are steps being made. NIH is supporting many of these studies. I'm trying to be more careful about giving credit to the National Institute of Health for the good research that it does fund. So I think that's an important part of it. But in the book, I think we make the point to clinicians that there's not a need to hurry your patients off of nicotine pouches or e-cigarettes unless there is something pressing in their medical history. The example we use most in the book of a situation where you would want somebody to get off of all the nicotine is pregnancy. So I feel that's one example of a situation where those of us who are pro harm reduction, we forget about that. Nicotine is not benign, particularly for the unborn fetus. It can affect development, and so there's an example where we do want to be helping somebody to get off all nicotine products if they can.